Zira stood in the middle of a grand auction hall, the cold, metallic floors echoing with the whispers of rich bidders from all corners of the galaxy. The air was thick with the scent of opulence, perfumed perfumes, and glowing holographic advertisements. The room was massive, stretching far beyond the eye could see, with walls lined with alien art and advanced technology. But none of it mattered to her. The bright lights above flickered, casting harsh shadows over her delicate features as she stood silently, her heart a heavy weight in her chest. Her skin, a soft shade of purple, seemed to shimmer faintly under the spotlights. The silver markings that ran down her arms glowed, but Zira felt nothing but emptiness. She had once been proud of her appearance, of the beauty her people valued, but now it was only a reminder of the shame her family had forced upon her. Her family had sold her. Her heart ached with the sting of betrayal. They had been struggling for weeks, struggling with debts, with starvation, with the cruelty of a world ruled by AI overlords. They had begged for help, but none came. In their desperation, they decided to sell their daughter, their only child. Zira was nothing more than an object now, a prize to be won by the highest bidder. As the auctioneer's voice rang out, listing her qualities, her beauty, her strength, her rare alien traits, Zira felt a hollow emptiness take over her. She could barely hear the bidding, her mind numb to the reality unfolding around her. She felt like a pawn, trapped in a game she never wanted to play. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer's voice was distant, fading into the background. Zira couldn't see the faces of the people bidding on her, but she could feel their eyes on her, cold, calculating, and full of desire. Each glance was a reminder of how much her life had changed in such a short time. A shiver ran down her spine as she tried to block out the thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. She remembered the look on her parents' faces as they had handed her over. Desperation had replaced the love she had once felt from them. They had promised her that they would come for her, that they would find a way to free her. But now she knew better. They were just words. She felt a sense of powerlessness creeping over her. There was nothing she could do. No one would save her. Not here. Not in a place where AI controlled everything, where people like her were reduced to nothing more than items on a marketplace. But as the auctioneer's voice began to call out the final bid, something inside Zira shifted. A quiet feeling of hope stirred deep within her chest. She wasn't sure where it came from, but it was there, faint, like a whisper in the dark. Someone had entered the auction hall, and Zira could feel his gaze upon her. She didn't know why, but this one person, standing in the shadows, gave her a strange sense of comfort. Eric. Zira didn't know his name, but she could tell he was different. Unlike the other bidders who looked at her with greedy eyes, his gaze was steady, intense, but not cruel. He wasn't here to take her as a possession. No, something about him told her that he understood what it felt like to be trapped, to be used. Zira couldn't explain it, but for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt as though she wasn't completely alone. The auctioneer, oblivious to the silent exchange happening between them, continued to hype up the price. 1 million credits. Do I hear 1.2 million? He called, his voice sharp and eager. Eric's gaze never wavered from Zira as the bidding continued. She saw his hand move toward his pocket, the gleam of a small device in his palm, but it was the way he moved that caught her attention. Calm, measured. There was no rush, no eagerness. He wasn't trying to win her like the others. It was as if he had already made up his mind about something. And then, in a sudden moment of clarity, Zira realized. The man wasn't bidding on her. He was going to take her. Sold, the auctioneer finally announced, his voice ringing through the hall. But it wasn't the sound of a victorious deal that struck Zira. It was the sudden movement of Eric, who stepped forward, offering to buy her. Freedom. The crowd was stunned as Eric took the lead, his voice calm and commanding. "I'll take her," he said simply. Not as a slave, but as a person. There was no hesitation in his words, no desire in his tone. He wasn't here for ownership. He was here to offer something Zira had never known: dignity. Her heart pounded in her chest as the auctioneer hesitated. It wasn't a typical bid. It wasn't how things were done here. But the man's confidence left no room for argument. In that moment, Zira felt her breath catch in her throat. Could this man be her chance? Could he truly save her? For a moment, the world around her seemed to disappear. The loud chatter, the bidding, the eyes on her. She couldn't focus on anything except her, the man who had just purchased her with the intent to save her. But just as the thought began to settle in her mind, Zira felt the cold weight of the guard's hands on her shoulders, pulling her away from the man. They were preparing to escort her out. Her heart raced with panic, but Eric's voice cut through the noise. Let her go. For the first time in a long while, Zira felt a flicker of hope ignite inside her. Could he really be the one to free her from this nightmare? The guards paused, uncertain. And then, to her amazement, Eric drew out a small glowing device from his pocket and pressed it against his wrist. Instantly, the lights above flickered, and the entire room plunged into darkness. A cloaking device activated, shrouding them in an impenetrable shield. In the chaos that followed, Eric grabbed Zira's arm and pulled her into the shadows, away from the eyes of the elite bidders. They moved swiftly, silently, as the world around them erupted into confusion. Zira didn't look back as they escaped. For the first time, she was no longer a pawn in someone else's game. She was free. And maybe, just maybe, this stranger could be the one to save her soul. The cloaking device hummed softly around them, hiding them from the chaos of the auction hall. For a moment, Zira could only hear her heart pounding in her ears. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps, but she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so alive. Eric's grip was firm on her arm, guiding her through the darkness, but it was a gentle kind of strength, comforting, like a promise. They moved swiftly through the shadows, the sounds of the auction hall fading behind them. Zira felt as though she was walking through a dream. How could this be real? A stranger, someone who barely knew her, had just bought her. Not for wealth, not for power, but for her freedom. It was a feeling Zira had almost forgotten existed. Eric led her into a small, hidden room behind the auction hall, where a narrow door slid open silently. Inside, it was quiet, the air still and cool. Zira looked around, her mind racing. The room was simple, no fancy decorations or luxurious furnishings, just the basics: a bed, a table, and a few chairs scattered about. But the most important thing was the absence of the wealthy, cruel faces that had watched her auctioned off like a piece of property. "Stay here," Eric said softly. His voice was calm, but there was a glint of something darker in his eyes. "I'm going to make sure we're clear before we leave. You'll be safe here." Zira nodded, her hands trembling slightly. She didn't want to question him, but she couldn't help the swirl of uncertainty in her mind. Why would a man like him, someone with such confidence, such power, want to risk everything for her? She had always believed that the world worked on a different set of rules, one that had nothing to do with kindness or justice. But Eric was proving her wrong, piece by piece. As he left the room, Zira sank down onto the bed, her legs weak beneath her. She had been through so much pain and heartache. The memory of her family's betrayal still burned in her mind. They had sold her, offered her as nothing more than an object to be bought and sold. But Eric, he had seen something in her, something no one else had bothered to look for. She wasn't just a slave to be used. She was a person worth saving. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft beeping sound. Eric's voice crackled through a small device on the table, his tone low but urgent. "They're after us," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We've got to move fast. The guards will be looking for us any minute now. Stay quiet. Stay close." Zira's heart skipped a beat. The auction house was crawling with security. Guards loyal to the wealthy bidders, A-controlled drones, and automated weapons systems that would stop at nothing to ensure their control. There was no telling how long they had before the entire place was on high alert. Eric didn't wait for a response. Zira heard him moving quickly through the corridor outside, his footsteps light but determined. A few seconds later, the door to the room opened again, and Eric stepped inside, his face grim. "We have to go now," he said, pulling Zira to her feet. "I don't know how much time we have before they lock down the building." Zira's pulse quickened as they made their way to the back exit, Eric leading the way. He was calm, focused, as if he had done this 100 times before. But Zira could feel the tension in the air. It was like a storm was about to break. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, and that every step brought them closer to danger. The exit was just ahead, a narrow door that led to an alleyway behind the auction hall. But as they approached, a loud crash echoed through the corridor. Zira's breath caught in her throat as she saw the shadows of guards rounding the corner, their weapons raised. The sound of their boots against the floor was deafening. "Run," Eric barked, and without thinking, Zira followed his lead. They sprinted toward the door, the sounds of pursuit growing louder behind them. Zira's legs burned with the effort, but she didn't stop. Not when Eric was right there beside her, urging her on, never looking back. The door slammed open, and they tumbled out into the dark alley. The cool night air hit Zira's face, sharp and refreshing, but it did nothing to calm her racing heart. She heard the clattering of metal behind them, the guards closing in, but Eric didn't slow down. He was leading them toward a small transport ship parked nearby, sleek, fast, and completely unmarked. "Get in," Eric ordered, his voice low and urgent. Zira didn't hesitate. She climbed into the ship, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the seat. The engines roared to life, and the ship shot forward, soaring into the night sky. For a moment, there was only the sound of the ship's engines, the wind rushing past. Zira looked out the window at the city below, the bright lights blurring into streaks of color. They were escaping. She was free. But even as the ship gained altitude, Zira couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the back of her mind. They weren't out of danger yet. They had made a dangerous purchase, one that was sure to bring trouble. Zira didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for sure: nothing in her life would ever be the same again. Eric was taking her to safety, but the journey ahead was anything but certain. Every moment, every decision, every risk they took would lead them into the unknown. But Zira no longer feared it, not with Eric by her side. For the first time in what felt like forever, Zira allowed herself to hope. Hope that maybe this was the beginning of something different, something worth fighting for. The ship zoomed through the dark sky, its sleek design cutting through the clouds with ease. Zira sat quietly in her seat, staring out the small window as the city below grew smaller and smaller. The lights of the auction hall were now just distant glimmers, swallowed up by the vastness of the night. But even though she was leaving that place behind, Zira couldn't shake the feeling that she was still trapped. She didn't know where she was going, what would happen to her next, or if this strange man, Eric, was truly someone she could trust. Eric sat at the controls of the ship, his focus entirely on the path ahead. He didn't speak, but Zira could feel his eyes occasionally darting toward her, making sure she was okay. His calmness was almost unnerving, as if he had been through this kind of escape many times before. She wanted to ask him questions, wanted to know what his plan was, where they were going, but the words wouldn't come. What could she possibly say? "Thank you." She wasn't sure she could trust her own feelings right now. Minutes stretched into hours as the ship sliced through the atmosphere, heading far away from the city. The silence between them was thick, and Zira couldn't help but think about her past. Her family's betrayal still stung, deep inside her. They had sold her without a second thought. Had they ever truly cared for her, or had she always been just another asset to them? Her mind flashed back to the auction, her parents standing there, faces unreadable, as she was presented to the highest bidder. They had promised her they would come for her, but deep down, Zira had known it wasn't true. No one came to save her. Not until Eric. Eric broke the silence, his voice calm but urgent. "We're headed to a safe house. It's far from here, so we should have time to lay low for a while. Once we land, I'll contact some allies who can help us get you to a more permanent place." Zira glanced at him, her heart still beating wildly in her chest. She wasn't sure if she believed him completely, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. This man, this stranger who had risked everything to free her, was offering her a chance at something she thought was lost forever. A chance to be free. But Zira couldn't let herself forget the danger. They had barely escaped the auction hall. The security was tight, and there were powerful enemies who wouldn't give up easily. She knew the risk wasn't over. The guards would be looking for them. They wouldn't stop until they found her, and the man who had taken her away. "Thank you," Zira whispered, barely able to hear her own voice over the hum of the ship's engines. "For saving me." Eric's gaze shifted to her, his eyes softening for the first time. "You don't need to thank me," he said quietly. "You didn't deserve what happened to you. No one deserves that." His voice held a weight of truth, a sincerity Zira hadn't known existed. "But we're not safe yet. We got a long way to go, and there's a lot you need to know." Zira nodded, her stomach tightening. She wanted to ask him what he meant, what was so dangerous about this journey, but something in his tone told her not to press. She didn't need to know everything right away. She just needed to survive. And right now, that was all that mattered. The ship continued its steady flight through the night, crossing vast stretches of barren land, mountains, and endless forests. The scenery outside the window was beautiful, but it only reminded Zira of how far she was from everything she had ever known. She had been a prisoner in her own life, her choices made for her by people who didn't care. Now she was flying toward an uncertain future, one that she could shape for herself, if she survived long enough to get there. As the hours passed, Zira tried to distract herself by focusing on the ship's interior. It was sleek and futuristic, everything carefully designed for practicality. There were no unnecessary comforts, but it felt safe, something she hadn't felt in so long. Eric seemed at ease in the pilot's seat, his hands moving with precision as he navigated the ship through the sky. His focus never wavered, and Zira could sense the experience in his movements. He was used to this, to danger, to the unknown. Finally, as dawn began to break across the horizon, the ship slowed. Zira's heart skipped a beat as she saw the outline of a small settlement in the distance. It was nothing like the city she had come from. There were no towering skyscrapers, no artificial lights blinding the sky. Instead, it was a quiet, peaceful place, a place where she could be safe, or so she hoped. Eric didn't speak as they approached the settlement. He landed the ship in a secluded area just outside of the main town, hidden away from prying eyes. As the ship touched down, the engines hummed down to a low whir. Zira's heart raced in her chest, but she remained silent. There was something almost surreal about this moment. She had never imagined she'd end up here, far from everything she had known. But now that she couldn't bring herself to feel scared. Not when Eric was beside her. "We need to move fast," Eric said, breaking the silence. "Stay close. Don't draw attention to yourself." Zira nodded, her heart pounding as they exited the ship. The air was cooler here, fresher, and the scent of pine trees filled her lungs. The world felt different, somehow. It was quiet, almost too quiet, and Zira couldn't help but wonder what Eric's plan was. Who were these allies he had mentioned? Were they truly trustworthy? But before she could ask, Eric was already moving ahead, leading her through the trees toward a small cabin in the distance. The cabin looked rustic, but solid, a safe haven away from the world she had known. Zira felt her heart slow as they approached, but the unease in her chest never fully left. She knew the danger wasn't over. It never truly was. But here, in this moment, there was something she hadn't felt in a long time. peace. As they reached the cabin, Eric turned to her. This is just the beginning, Zira. You're free now, but you'll need to stay strong. This world is dangerous, and it's full of people who will try to take you back. But we'll fight, together. Zira met his gaze, her heart full of gratitude and a flicker of hope. For the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, freedom was possible. The small cabin was quiet, tucked away in the woods far from the hustle and bustle of the city. Zira stood by the window, staring out at the peaceful landscape, but inside, her thoughts were anything but calm. The night air outside was crisp, but it did little to cool the storm brewing in her mind. She had been freed, yes, but was she truly safe? Every corner of the cabin felt like a reminder that danger still loomed, lurking just beyond the trees. Eric had led her here, but now he was keeping his distance. He had told her to rest, but there was something in his eyes when he left her alone. It was as if he was hiding something important. Zira had seen it before, the kind of look someone gets when they are keeping a dangerous secret. She knew it well because her family had done the same thing to her for years. They had hidden their true intentions behind sweet words and false promises. She wasn't about to trust anyone without knowing the whole story. Hours passed, and Zira tried to distract herself by looking around the cabin. It was simple, with basic furniture and a wood-burning stove in the corner. It smelled of pine and fresh wood, a stark contrast to the sterile, lifeless rooms she had grown used to. For a moment, it almost felt like a dream, a place where she could forget everything that had happened to her. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Just as she was about to sit down and try to sleep, the door creaked open. Eric walked in, his face shadowed by something Zira couldn't place. His eyes were intense, more serious than she had ever seen them before. He closed the door behind him and locked it, as if making sure no one could get in. His movements were quick, deliberate. "I need to talk to you, Zira," he said, his voice low. It wasn't the tone he had used before, the tone of comfort and safety. This was different. It was as if something dark was hanging over his words. Zira turned to face him, her stomach tightening. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. "What's going on, Eric? Why are you acting like this?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Eric took a deep breath and ran a hand through his hair. "I didn't want to tell you this yet, but I don't think I can keep it from you any longer." He hesitated, clearly struggling to find the right words. Zira's heart began to race. Whatever he was about to say, it wasn't going to be easy. "I'm not just some random person who stumbled into that auction hall and decided to save you," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "I have a history with your family, with your people." Zira's brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about?" Eric's eyes darkened, and he stepped closer to her, his voice urgent. "Your family didn't just sell you for money, Zira. They sold you for a purpose. You're not the first one to go through this. You're part of something much bigger. And now, I'm caught up in it." Zira felt the ground shift beneath her. Everything she thought she knew about her life, about her family, was unraveling in front of her. "What do you mean? What is this about?" Eric took another step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. "Your family is involved with an organization that's much more dangerous than you could imagine. They've been working with powerful people, people who have control over advanced technology, weapons, and even people like me." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "They've been using people like you as pawns in their bigger plan. You're not the only one they've sold." Zira felt a chill run down her spine. Her parents, the people she had trusted most in the world, were connected to something dark and far-reaching. She had always known there was more to their wealth and influence than met the eye, but this was beyond anything she could have imagined. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Eric's eyes softened for a moment. "I wanted to protect you. I didn't want to scare you. But I can't lie to you anymore. They're going to come for you. They'll stop at nothing to get you back. And when they do, they'll have more power than you can imagine." Zira took a step back, trying to process everything he was saying. What does that mean for me? What do they want with me? Eric's jaw tightened. They're using people like you to create something. Something they believe will change everything. They're working on a project, something they've been perfecting for years. And you, Zira, are the key to it. Zira felt her breath catch in her throat. She was the key. But to what? She had no special skills, no powers. She was just a girl who had been sold by her family. What could she possibly be a key to? Her mind raced, trying to piece together the puzzle, but it felt like the more she learned, the more questions she had. Eric took a deep breath, his voice lowering even further. I don't know all the details, but I know enough to tell you that you're in danger. And I'm not just here to help you escape. I'm here to make sure they don't get their hands on you. Zira stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had thought her life was difficult before, but now it felt like the ground was shifting beneath her. She had been saved, but at what cost? Who was Eric really, and what was this project her family had been involved in? As the night stretched on, Zira felt more lost than ever. The dangerous truth had been revealed, but it only led to more questions. She wasn't sure who to trust anymore, Eric, her family, or even herself. All she knew was that she was caught in the middle of something much bigger than her, and the journey ahead was going to be far more treacherous than she could have imagined. The morning sun filtered through the dense trees surrounding the cabin, casting dappled shadows on the floor. Zira sat at the small wooden table, her hands trembling as she held a cup of water. She had barely slept through the night, the weight of Eric's words pressing down on her chest like a stone. She had always known her life was complicated, but now it felt like everything she had known was built on a lie. Eric had left early, saying he needed to check on some things, but Zira wasn't ready to sit back and wait anymore. She had to find out more. She needed to understand what was going on, why her family had sold her, and why she was so important. The answers were out there, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially Eric, keep them from her. Zira stood up, feeling a surge of determination coursed through her. For the first time since her life had been turned upside down, she didn't feel like a victim. She wasn't going to just sit here and wait for someone else to fix things for her. She was going to take control of her own fate. She walked over to the small window, looking out at the quiet forest. The world seemed peaceful on the surface, but she knew better. There was a storm brewing, and she had no intention of letting it catch her off guard. As she turned away from the window, her mind began to race. She had been trained all her life to be quiet, to do as she was told. Her family's influence had taught her how to behave, how to please, how to be the perfect pawn. But everything had changed the moment she'd escaped the auction. She wasn't their puppet anymore. She was free, and with that freedom came a responsibility. One she was beginning to understand. Zira walked to the small bookshelf by the wall and began sifting through the few books that were scattered across the shelves. Most of them were old, filled with tales of adventure and far-off places, but one book caught her eye. It was an old journal, its pages worn and yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, scanning the first few pages. To her surprise, it wasn't just a collection of stories. It was a record of plans, codes, and sketches that made little sense to her at first. The journal belonged to someone named Orcs. Zira didn't know who that was, but from the writing, it seemed like they had been involved in some sort of project. As she read, she realized that some of the plans in the journal seemed to match the little details Eric had shared about her family's secret dealings. It was clear now. Her family was involved in far more than just selling her. They were working with people who had plans that went far beyond anything she could have imagined. Zira flipped through the pages, looking for any clue that could help her understand the bigger picture. She found references to a place, an old hidden facility far from here. The facility seemed to be at the center of the experiments her family was involved in. According to the journal, the facility was where people like her had been taken and where their lives had been shaped by others for years. Her heart raced. She had to get there, It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about stopping whatever plans her family had set in motion. She couldn't let them use anyone else like they had used her. She couldn't let this twisted legacy continue. She had to stop it, no matter what it took. With a newfound sense of urgency, Zira grabbed a small pack and began stuffing it with supplies, water, food, and a few tools she could find. She didn't know exactly what she would need, but she wasn't going to take any chances. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that she couldn't rely on Eric to fix everything. He had his own secrets, and while she wanted to trust him, she couldn't afford to put all her faith in someone who might not be telling her the whole truth. Zira heard the sound of footsteps approaching the cabin and quickly stuffed the journal into her pack. She moved toward the door, but as she reached for the handle, she hesitated. Was she ready to face whatever awaited her? Could she really take on everything her family had built? It felt impossible, but Zira knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back to the way things were. The door creaked open, and Eric stepped inside. His eyes immediately locked onto her pack, and his expression shifted to one of concern. "Zira, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice tense. Zira turned to face him, her jaw set with determination. "I'm not just going to sit here anymore. I know what's going on. I've read the journal. I know about the facility, and I'm going to stop it." Eric's face turned pale. "You don't understand. It's not that simple. You can't just walk in there and think you can fix everything. There are people who will do whatever it takes to stop you." Zira's heart was pounding, but her resolve only grew stronger. "I'm not asking for permission. I'm going." Eric looked like he wanted to argue, but there was a moment of silence before he sighed deeply. "You're right. You're not asking for permission. But you can't do this alone." Zira stared at him for a long moment, unsure of whether to trust him. But deep down, she knew she couldn't do this alone. "Then help me," she said, her voice steady. "We have to stop them. For good." Eric hesitated but then nodded. "All right, but we do it my way. We'll need a plan." Zira felt a mix of relief and fear wash over her. She wasn't sure what awaited her at that hidden facility, but she wasn't backing down. The battle was just beginning, and she was ready to take the first step toward reclaiming control of her life and her future. Together, they would face whatever dangers lay ahead. And together, they would fight for a future where no one else would have to suffer the way she had. The fight wasn't just about freedom anymore. It was about survival, and Zira was ready to win. The facility was massive, hidden deep within the mountains. Its towering walls rose into the sky like a fortress, the dark, metal surface reflecting the dim light of the setting sun. Zira's heart pounded in her chest as she stood at the edge of the clearing, her eyes fixed on the looming structure ahead. This was it, the place that had controlled her life for so long, the place where her family's darkest secrets had been hidden, and where her destiny would be shaped. Eric stood beside her, his face tense, but his eyes were focused. He was ready, but Zira could sense the uncertainty lingering beneath his calm exterior. They had come this far together, and there was no turning back now. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future of everyone who had been manipulated, controlled, and discarded by the powerful forces behind this facility. Zira took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She had already faced so much: betrayal, fear, and loss. And now she stood on the brink of the final confrontation. The truth was within her grasp, but it was also protected by a web of lies and deceit. The facility held answers, but it was also the birthplace of the pain that had scared her soul. They moved quickly, staying in the shadows as they approached the entrance. The security was tight, with guards patrolling the perimeter, but Zira had learned how to be silent, how to blend into the darkness when needed. She wasn't afraid of being caught. Not anymore. The only thing that mattered was reaching the heart of the facility and uncovering the truth. As they approached the large steel doors, Eric turned to her. His voice was low, filled with concern. "Are you sure about this? Once we go in, there's no going back." Zira looked at him, her expression unwavering. "There's no other choice. This has to end. Eric, I have to know the truth. I can't let them keep controlling me, or anyone else." He nodded silently, his eyes filled with a mix of admiration and worry. They knew the risks, but there was no way to back out now. They had come too far. Together, they slipped inside the facility, moving with purpose, avoiding the guards, and staying out of sight. The dark, cold halls of the facility seemed endless, stretching in every direction. The air was thick with the smell of metal and machinery, the hum of technology vibrating through the walls. It was a place of secrets, a place where lives had been shaped and destroyed by the cold hands of science and power. Zira's mind raced as they made their way deeper into the heart of the facility. She had so many questions about her family, about the experiments, about everything. But there was one question that burned brighter than all the rest. Why was she so important? Why had they sold her, and why had they allowed her to escape? They finally reached a door marked Research Facility. It was heavy, reinforced with steel, and there was no way to see what lay beyond it. Zira's heart raced as she placed her hand on the cold metal, her mind filled with anticipation and dread. She knew that what she would find on the other side could change everything: her past, her future, and the fate of those who had been hurt by the same people who had controlled her life. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit, filled with rows of computers, machines, and medical equipment. The walls were lined with files, records, charts, and documents, each one a piece of the puzzle she had been trying to solve. And then, at the center of the room, she saw it. A large glass tank filled with strange, swirling liquid. Inside the tank was a figure. Another girl, her face obscured by the liquid. But Zira knew who it was. It was her. The shock hit her like a wave. She stumbled back, unable to tear her eyes away from the sight in front of her. The girl inside the tank looked exactly like her. Same eyes, same hair, same features, but the look on her face was one of pure emptiness. She was a clone, created for a purpose that Zira couldn't yet comprehend. Eric stepped forward, his face grim. "This is what they've been doing. They've been creating clones, using people like you, like me, like everyone they control, for some experiment. They were planning to use you too." Zira's voice cut through the silence, raw with emotion. "To replace me, to erase me." She could barely speak the words, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her chest. She had been nothing more than a tool, a piece in someone else's game. Her entire life had been a lie, manipulated by forces she couldn't even begin to understand. The girl in the tank was her, but she was also a symbol of everything that had been stolen from her. The freedom to live her own life, to make her own choices, to be herself. Zira's fists clenched at her sides. She wasn't going to let this stand. She wasn't going to let them erase her or anyone else. She had already been through too much, and now she had the power to end it. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who had been exploited, for every soul that had been sold, for every life that had been controlled. "Eric," she said, her voice steady but filled with fury, "we need to destroy this place. Everything here, every record, every file, has to be wiped out." Eric nodded. "We can do that. But we need to move fast. There's no telling what kind of backup they have. Once we start, they won't stop coming." Zira's eyes narrowed as she turned toward the machines. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to let fear control her. With one last look at the girl in the tank, she stepped forward, determined to end this once and for all. Together, they worked quickly, disabling the systems, burning the records, and shutting down the machines that had caused so much pain. As the facility began to shake, Zira felt a surge of hope, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just freedom she was gaining, it was control. She was taking back her life, her future, and her soul. The destruction of the facility was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Zira had won. The truth had been uncovered, and with it, her soul had been set free. She wasn't a victim anymore. She was a warrior, a survivor, and she would make sure no one else would ever be sold, controlled, or erased again. The victory was not just hers. It was the victory of all those who had fought to reclaim their souls from the darkness, and it was just the beginning of the fight to come.